The age of revolution. Revolution in military discipline. Revolution in America as rebels die for liberty. Revolution in a soldier's will to fight. In France, the bloodiest revolution of all. And in a muddy field in Belgium, the last chapter in the Gunpowder Revolution. This is Frederick the Great, King of Prussia. In the 1740s, he took the province of Silesia from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In 1757, Frederick defended his new territory. He marched his army 200 miles in 16 days to meet an Austrian invasion near the town of Leuthen. Outnumbered 2-1, Frederick used a tactic that became his hallmark. He marched his Prussians toward the Austrian front, then wheeled them to the right under cover of low hills. They reappeared suddenly to the left of the Austrian army, which was being hammered by Prussian artillery. The Austrians were crushed. All of Prussia celebrated the great victory. From the Sanssouci Palace near Berlin, Frederick ruled his growing kingdom. The army Frederick created was unmatched by any in Europe. Its secret was drill. Today, drill seems purely ceremonial. But on the 18th century battlefield, it meant the difference between life and death. Men who can march precisely in time and change direction and speed as one on the parade ground can do the same in battle. This is exactly what Frederick had his troops do at Leuthen. They changed direction while hidden from the Austrians, then reappeared where least expected. The drill perfected by Frederick is still practiced by modern armies today. Frederick's tactics at Leuthen were a masterpiece of precise battlefield maneuver, but they were achieved at a cost.
The tactics of 18th century gunpowder armies required men to perform drill in a very rigid and methodical way, and in a sense they had to be beaten into it. There's a famous phrase of Frederick's that the men must be more frightened of their officers than they are of the enemy, and I think Frederiциan discipline was very severe indeed. He did literally flog his armies.
With his ruthlessly disciplined army, Frederick took on Austria, Sweden, Russia, and France. Prussian aggression gave Britain the opportunity to attack her arch-rival, France. She joined the war on Prussia's side. A conflict that began in Europe now spread worldwide. It would last 7 long years.
The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, is often described as the First World War. And it became one, I think, for 2 reasons. One was that the combatants, Britain and France particularly, had large enough fleets to project power to great distances, the sailing warship having become an enormously powerful instrument of strategic outreach.
Around the globe, on land, but most often at sea, wherever the British and French found each other, they fought. The key weapon was the warship. Equipped with cannon, it was the single most costly, powerful, and advanced weapon system of its day. These were floating fortresses. A single warship carried as much firepower as an entire army. Sea battles raged off India, Africa, and the Americas. But it was a dangerous game for the French. In a single year, the British captured 6,000 French sailors and 300 trading vessels. French ships were being sunk faster than France could build them. And they were expensive. In this long war of attrition, the ability to pay for new ships was almost as important as winning battles. Here Britain had the advantage. As an island nation, she spent most of her defense budget on ships, and Britain was wealthy, the world's most successful trading nation. By the mid-18th century, the British Royal Navy had built 300 vessels, worth $2.5 billion at today's prices. The French, with a large and costly land army to support, couldn't compete in shipbuilding. And the more ships Britain made, the more powerful she became, protecting her trading interests, fighting off rivals, and claiming more colonies. This created yet greater wealth. British sea power in the 18th century was a partnership between government and business. The Bank of England was founded in 1694 to fund a commercial war against the Dutch. In the 7 Years' War, France could not match Britain's ability to raise loans for the arms race. The British Navy won victory after victory over the French. By the end of the 7 Years' War, Britain had overwhelmed the French Navy. France had lost her most valuable colonies in Africa, India, and the Caribbean. The global war that Prussia started left Britain ruling the waves and poised to build an empire that would cover a quarter of the globe. The greatest prize for Britain was North America. In a series of victories spearheaded by the Royal Navy, the British advanced through the St. Lawrence Seaway into the Great Lakes and down the Hudson River. By the end of the war, Britain had replaced France as the dominant power in North America. Only 20 years later, Britain would face an enemy in North America that would challenge her global supremacy. This enemy would be inspired by revolutionary ideas and led by a soldier who fought for Britain in the 7 Years' War. His name was George Washington. In the mid-18th century, the British Army and Navy were invincible. Then in 1775, in the colonies of North America, they met a new kind of enemy.
What's distinctive and I think unprecedented about the American War of Independence is that the army of the rebels against King George III fought for an idea They had taken a decision that they were badly ruled and that they were entitled to rule themselves, and that was the principal reason for which they were fighting.
The military key to America was the Northeast. And the key to the Northeast was the Hudson River, which linked the British colony of New York via Lake Champlain to the St. Lawrence Seaway and Canada in the north. In a mountainous region that was densely forested and inhabited by Indians, the Hudson River was America's first military highway. The British Army in America was a conventional 18th century force of brutally disciplined professional soldiers.
Cock your pilot! Fire!
They were supplemented by highly drilled foreign troops,
The Landsduck!
Hessians, who came from Germany and had fought for the British in the 7 Years' War.
Aye!
One of them, Johann Conrad Goethe, kept a diary throughout the Revolutionary War.
The English keep their clothing very clean and have only the vices of cussing, swearing, drinking, whoring, and stealing. And these more so than almost all other people.
Such was the reputation of the British. The American rebel army had no reputation at all. America had never even had an army.
Very early on, the colonists recognized that it was essential to cut the Hudson line, which meant that the British would not be able to use the Hudson as their main channel of communication between their Canadian base and their zone of operations in the rebel area.
The colonists' first organized attack was against Fort Ticonderoga on the Hudson River south of Lake Champlain. It was a bold and successful assault led by the maverick commander Benedict Arnold. It gave the colonists control of the Hudson River, America's military highway. A month after the victory at Ticonderoga, a new general took control of the rebel army, George Washington. Washington was a rarity in the rebel army because he had real military experience, having fought for the British in the 7 Years' War. The troops Washington commanded had no experience of war. At the Battle of Long Island in August 1776, they fled from a 20,000-strong British army. Washington was the last man to quit the battlefield. But it wasn't in the Americans' nature to give up, and they were driven by a powerful reason to fight: liberty. A month before their defeat at Long Island, the rebels had made a revolutionary proclamation, the Declaration of Independence. They demanded the right to determine their own future without interference from Britain. What began as a dispute over taxes was now a fight for an ideal that every American soldier was ready to die for. The rebels lacked military training, but they were highly motivated. Their lack of sophistication, combined with their passion, led to a particular style of warfare.
Enemy patrols appeared, which approached our outposts through the bushes, fired upon them, and ran away again. This continued every day, and some days more than once. From this, one can easily understand the difference between such a war and a war in Europe.
The Americans couldn't compete with the British in a stand-and-fight set-piece battle. But they could use the guerrilla tactics of hit and run. The British would never dare, as they feared their poorly paid troops would just run away. In America, something new in the history of war and civilization was born: an army motivated by a political ideal. This shared loyalty gave its apparent disorder a lethal edge. The Americans, unfettered by military convention, were highly mobile. The British and Hessians, who fought in close order formation, made easy targets.
Their slowness is of the greatest disadvantage in a country almost covered by woods, and against an enemy whose chief qualification is running from fence to fence, and thence keeping up an irregular but galling fire on troops who advance with the same pace as at their exercise.
The new American tactics were not just effective on land. In the autumn of 1776, Benedict Arnold built 8 fighting ships in just 6 weeks and commandeered 5 more. His 13 ships took on Britain's Royal Navy on Lake Champlain in defense of Fort Ticonderoga to the south. Arnold used guerrilla tactics on water. He hid his ships behind Valcour Island and waited for the British to sail past. When they saw the Americans, they had to turn back into the wind. Arnold's 86 naval guns pounded them. Eventually, the British won. Arnold sank his ships to prevent their capture and retreated, but Fort Ticonderoga was safe until the spring. Under Washington's leadership, the Americans grew into a disciplined force capable of fighting pitched battles. In July 1777, the British recaptured Fort Ticonderoga. This led to a pair of battles at Saratoga, a small town in New York State, halfway between New York City and Montreal. They squared off in September and again in October. Horatio Gates led 20,000 Americans to victory over 5,000 British. For the British, it was humiliation. For the rebels, Saratoga was the turning point of the war. With Britain on the run, France recognized American independence. Then she declared war on Britain. What started as a small war of independence against a colonial power turned into a world conflict. Spain and Holland now declared war on Britain. The Americans took full advantage. Revolutionary fervor motivated Americans to victory over Britain and created a new nation. In France, Napoleon would combine revolutionary fervor and military genius to conquer old nations.
Shoulder! Shoulder! Firelock!
Our men stood amazingly well. Not even one showed a disposition to shrink. Our orders were not to fire until the enemy came within 50 yards of us. But when they perceived we stood their fire so coolly and resolutely, they declined coming any nearer, though treble our number. Our men fought with more than Roman valor.
In the American Revolutionary War, a new factor entered the history of warfare. It gave these American soldiers the courage to fight off the world's most powerful nation Britain, even though outnumbered 3-1. The new factor was political. These soldiers were committed to the cause of liberty and the right to determine their nation's future. The revolution was a cause worth dying for. Not since the triumphant armies of Islam 1,000 years before had the world witnessed the battle-winning potential of an army willing to die for an ideal. In 18th century America, the religious ideal that motivated Muhammad's followers was replaced by a political ideal, revolution. In the 20th century, political ideals continued to inspire men to victory against the odds. Marxism and nationalism inspired the Viet Cong to hold out against the world's greatest power, America. The Nazis' perverted ideals of racial supremacy and fatherland inspired Hitler's German armies to take on the combined might of Europe, Russia, and America, and almost win. But when there is no great idea or cause to motivate men to fight, other factors encourage them to risk their lives.
I think it's possible to see three factors which keep groups of men together in the extremes of combat, when everything says that they should give up and run away, when they're possessed by extreme fear, risk to their lives. One is coercion, simply people making them fight, superiors making them fight. Another is inducement. Commonly in the past, the reason to go on fighting was that if you won, there'd be loot of some form or other, everything from women to gold. And finally, there's anesthesia or narcosis. It's common for men to dose themselves with drink or drugs in order to palliate their fear. And that seems to have been a pattern from as early as we have records to the present day. I mean, the Greeks certainly drank wine before going into battle. And there seems to be considerable evidence that American soldiers in Vietnam took drugs because they were frightened. But all the same, there is something beyond inducement, narcosis, and coercion, which I call the X factor. Something happens to groups of men when they band together to face danger together.
When you spend long periods of time with the same 2 or 3 guys inside a armored vehicle, you become very close. There aren't too many secrets you keep from one another. There is a bond between those soldiers. And when something goes awry, you're not only concerned with yourself, but you're concerned with everybody on that vehicle.
Even in the best organized campaigns, things go wrong. In war, soldiers die, often next to their closest comrades.
You go through the grieving process just like anybody else does, except you have a lot of other things going on or it's going to happen again. So you've got to get through that grieving process, understand the grieving process, get through it, help everybody around you get through it, and then move on and keep plugging away at getting that mission accomplished. But you got to understand that you are going to grieve just as if you lost a family member.
Men are much more willing to fight hard and to fight well if they know they'll be cared for if wounded or sick. The Greeks and Romans developed basic military medical care. In today's armies, it's a high priority. The Allied soldiers who fought in the Gulf War knew that if they were wounded, help was at hand.
I would say of the Gulf War, every soldier knew that if he or she got injured, that they would receive immediate treatment and what I call primary care, surgery, if necessary, within 6 hours of being injured. It played on the mind and thought, yeah, I'm part of a good organisation, we can do it. So yeah, I think it had an effect on morale. without a shadow of a doubt.
But medical care is part of the civilized face of war. Even today, primitive forces sometimes motivate soldiers to fight.
Roger that. Right turn. Coming right.
A mixture of adrenaline and testosterone, the sheer exhilaration of combat.
3, 2, 1. Should be impact. Boom! Oh, yes!
It's true that the exhilaration of combat is often described, that people feel a sense of power and release when they're able to use their weapons, when they can see the effect of their fire on the enemy, when they're gripped by the intense activity and emotion of combat. But although it's an undoubted phenomenon, I do have to say that the records suggest that it's transient and associated particularly with the first experience of combat, before people learn how dangerous it is, before they learn fear.
Exhilaration may encourage soldiers into battle, but more tangible benefits keep men in armies over the long term. Retirement benefits attract the career soldier.
You're looking at the most handsome man in the hospital.
These inducements or benefits aren't new. The greatest ancient army, Rome's, gave soldiers land in return for a lifetime's work. Today, armies offer a place to live, 3 meals a day, and the companionship of old comrades. Beyond the material benefits an army might offer its veterans, there's another intangible factor which for centuries has inspired men to fight: the notion of honor.
I'll never surrender of my own free will. If in command, I'll never surrender the members of my command while they still have.
The men of the court are dead. Their hearts are standing attention while we wait for the passing tread. You sons of today, we salute you. You sons of an earlier day, we follow close order behind you, where you have pointed the way.
It is strange that we talk about honor in warfare, but it's omnipresent, I think. It has existed from early times. It's been observed from early times and is observed today. The well-armed, distinguished man of war doesn't want to use his weapons against some contemptible, badly armed groundling. He wants to fight people like himself because that's what makes him admired, both on his own side and curiously on the other side as well. And he seeks admiration by the enemy almost as much as he does by his own side. And so from very, very early, from the earliest records of warfare almost, you find accounts of what we would call honor.
You have respect for them because they're soldiers just like you. I mean, you don't dwell on the fact that you're taking human life, but it's part of your mission. You have to move on with it. And when given the opportunity, you treat them with dignity if they surrender, and treat them just as if you'd want to be treated if you were in their shoes.
But of all the factors that go to create a battle-winning army, honor, discipline, comradeship, rewards, exhilaration, the greatest is the power of an ideal to motivate men. The revolutionary ideals of the American colonists won them a great victory against the British. A decade later, an ideal would again inspire an army, the greatest revolutionary army the world had seen, the Republican Army of France. Paris, 1789. A mob of angry, hungry Parisians storms the royal prison, the Bastille. The first act of violence in a revolution that will sweep away 1,000 years of rule by kings. Like the American Revolution before it, the French Revolution would have a radical effect on war and civilization. The Americans' goal was simple: to throw out the British and govern themselves. The French Revolution sought to change an old society from top to bottom. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. In the name of these high ideals, thousands of French aristocrats met their deaths at the hand of the mob or the blade of the guillotine. As the Revolution changed the face of France, it changed the face of the French army. In 1789, 85% of army officers were aristocrats. 5 years later, the guillotine and exile had reduced that to 3%. With powerful enemies outside France, the new republic needed an army, and needed it quickly. In 1791, the republic trained 100,000 volunteer citizens and turned them into an army. In 1792, yet more volunteers joined up, but still the republic needed more men as it found itself fighting Prussia, Austria, and Holland. For the first time in history, every able-bodied man was called to fight for his country. The French revolutionary government called an entire nation to arms.
Young men will go to battle. Married men will forge arms and transport supplies. Women will make tents, uniforms, and serve in hospitals. Children will pick rags. Old men will have themselves carried to public squares to inspire the courage of the warriors and to preach the hatred of kings and the unity of the Republic.
By the summer of 1794, 1 million men from every social class, from every occupation, from every part of France had joined the army of the French Revolution. It was the largest European army ever assembled. To inspire this vast army with revolutionary fervor, the government distributed millions of copies of official bulletins, radical newspapers, and patriotic songs.
Que nous prendrons si en campagne nous partons. Ah, si demain nous partions en campagne, les grands coups de canon paieront les coups de canne.
Not only was the revolution to be protected within France, it was to be exported. People everywhere would be freed from the yoke of monarchy and aristocracy. The French soldiers who fought across Europe from Spain to Moscow thought of themselves as liberators, not conquerors.
C'était un soir, en battant la retraite, en pensant à Samy que toujours il regrette.
The idea begun by the French in the 1790s would reach its full potential in the vast armies and universal conscription of World War I. In France, men willingly served in the army because the state made them citizens. By World War I, this idea was universally accepted, and every able-bodied male citizen was called to arms. The French army was now based firmly on the notion of equality. Soldiers could rise through the ranks by talent rather than class. This meant the very best soldiers became officers, and gave the French army a huge advantage over opponents who considered aristocratic birth the main qualification. The most talented of them was a young Corsican artillery officer, Napoleon Bonaparte. His success on the battlefield was phenomenal. In 1804, at the age of 35, he proclaimed himself Emperor of France.
Napoleon had a Roman relentlessness and ruthlessness. He was in a way a reincarnation of Rome 1,000 years or more after the empire had died. He benefited from the transformation of France into a war-making state immediately after the Revolution. The Revolution turned France into a war-making state.
In Napoleon, the post-revolutionary army found a military genius to develop it further. Though Napoleon's army was no longer a revolutionary force, it was still an army of Frenchmen, sons of their nation and inspired by their leader. Napoleon continued to promote the best men, regardless of birth. Of his 26 most senior officers, one was a bandsman before 1789. 4 were sergeants, and 3 were privates. One of these, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, ended his career as King of Sweden. Radical new officers created radical new ways of running an army. In 1792, the Revolutionary Army had created the first combat division, a miniature army of a few thousand men. It combined infantry, cavalry, and artillery, and could operate independently or with other divisions. The divisional system continues to this day in the U.S. Army and Marines. Napoleon perfected the system. He subdivided his army into individual corps, each with its own commander and responsibility for supplying itself. This is how Napoleon was able to move huge armies quickly. Jean-Pierre Blaise, a corps officer, made a lightning march from the north coast of France east across Europe to Vienna and Austerlitz in 1805.
We were ordered to leave all unnecessary possessions at the depot, so we would be burdened with as little as possible. The rapidity of our march did not permit food supplies to follow us, but we were able to do without bread because we were in the midst of the best season for potatoes in the country where they are very good. How many times did we ruin the villagers' hopes? We stole the product of a year's work.
The speed and foraging skills of Jean-Pierre and his comrades allowed Napoleon to march 500 miles in 5 weeks, the quickest march since the days of Genghis Khan. Arriving in the east with unexpected speed, Napoleon took the Austrians and the Russians by surprise, capturing Vienna and Austerlitz. By the end of 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte was master of the European mainland. But he wasn't master of the sea. His opponent was the British Admiral Horatio Nelson. Like Napoleon, Nelson was a man whose daring and skill won him rapid promotion through the ranks. Throughout 1805, Nelson chased the French fleet, finally bringing them to battle on October 21st near Cape Trafalgar. Nelson ignored the tradition of drawing alongside enemy ships to exchange broadsides. He invented a new tactic, the melee, giving his captains free rein to get in among the French ships. In the mayhem that followed, superior seamanship secured victory. But Nelson himself was killed shot by a French sniper at the moment of his greatest triumph. Napoleon continued to be master on land until he decided to invade Russia. The Russian campaign of 1812 ended in disaster when winter set in. Napoleon's army suffered 300,000 casualties. Most froze or starved to death. But Napoleon Bonaparte would not be finished off easily. He already had fought more battles and won more victories than Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and Julius Caesar combined. He would be back. March 1815. Napoleon Bonaparte returned from exile on the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba, determined once more to be master of Europe. Only Britain and her allies, Prussia and Austria, could stop him. The battle would take place here at Waterloo in modern Belgium. Waterloo was a huge battle involving 190,000 men. Yet the battlefield itself was tiny, only a mile square. At each end were fortified farmhouses. On one side, La Haye-Saint, on the other, Hougoumont. Both would prove crucial in the battle. The two armies were exhausted. For days there had been vicious skirmishing.
They'd had very little sleep the night before, and perhaps not the night before that either. They'd both marched quite a long distance. The night of June the 17th, 18th was awful, pouring rain, and they'd all got up wet because they'd slept in the open.
For the French, the presence of Napoleon was the best cure for aching limbs and the greatest inspiration to fight. Napoleon was anxious to start the battle. He knew that Britain's 50,000 Prussian allies had not arrived. Without them, the two armies were equally matched at about 70,000 men each. But Napoleon was waiting for a heavy overnight rain to drain from the battlefield to give his horses a better chance. The crack French cavalry, the cuirassiers, exercised their horses, knowing that their role could be decisive. The British commander, the Duke of Wellington, was waiting too. He wanted Napoleon to make the first move. Just before 11 in the morning, French infantry began to form their lines. The French artillerymen primed their guns. Napoleon was ready. 246 French cannon started the bombardment.
But Wellington had made his men lie down. Most of the French cannonballs went over the top. Unfortunately, in some places, there wasn't cover. One British battalion in particular, the 27th, were exposed to artillery fire for an hour or more. And when they marched away, at the end, they left behind them a square of their own dead and wounded.
At the same time, fighting began for the buildings at either end of the battlefield. One of these was Hougoumont, a fortified farmhouse held by the British.
The French came forward to try and break into Hougoumont and so crumble the right-hand end of Wellington's line, which would have desperately weakened his position. So a terrible, bitter little battle took place actually inside Hougoumont, intensely hand-to-hand. The French actually broke down the great farmyard door. A giant of a Frenchman, known to history as l'enfonceur, the man who broke in, actually got through. But the British managed to close the door behind him. They then raced round the courtyard, chasing the French, chasing them upstairs into attics. They were pinned into small confined spaces and skewered to death. They killed every single French soldier who got into the courtyard, except there was a little drummer boy whose life was spared.
When Napoleon thought his artillery had softened up Wellington's lines sufficiently, he sent in his cavalry. They charged into the valley and up the little slope toward the crest where the British were standing.
Wellington then made his men stand up. And of course they formed square. That's to say there was a front, two sides, and a back to each of the battalion formations. This was the way infantry were trained to stand when they were charged by cavalry. They were also trained not to shoot until the cavalry were within killing range, and that meant only 50 yards perhaps. A terrible test of the nerves of the soldiers as they saw this mass of horses bearing down on them.
One officer described the sound of musket balls striking the breastplates of French cavalry as like hailstones beating on glass.
These were disciplined soldiers, and they did hold their fire, and once they held their fire, it was the cavalry who were scattered, not the infantry, because horses will not ride into massed musketry fire. They won't ride onto bayonets. So the cavalry fanned out, went round the sides of the squares, passed out into the back area of the Allied line, and then reformed and galloped back again. This was the pattern of the battle during the afternoon. Some of the British squares were charged 12 times, fired 12 times, and survived 12 times. None of the British squares was broken by cavalry on the day of Waterloo.
Napoleon saw his artillery and cavalry assaults hadn't worked. It was time to send in his elite infantry, the Imperial Guard.
This was the decisive moment of the battle. Wellington galloped to the point, stood behind his troops, waited, suddenly judged the moment when the French would be in range. The officers took the range, gave the order. A huge blast of musketry crashed out. The head of the French column reeled, shook, and began to fall back. And indeed, curiously, it was the French guardsmen at the back of the column who began to run away first. They'd sensed that the moment of decision had come and had passed. It had passed to the favor of the British, that they were defeated. And Wellington said to one of his commanders, "Go on, Coburn, they won't stand." Standing was crucial to the rhythm and dynamics of a gunpowder battle. And so the British infantry began to move forward, to follow them, to fire volleys into the retreating enemy. Wellington followed them on his horse, riding across the indescribable carnage of the battlefield, where men and horses lay dead in thousands, 10,000 dead horses on the battlefield, 40,000 dead and wounded men. There was a night of unimaginable, unspeakable suffering, when the battlefield was loud with the cries of dying and wounded men and animals. There'd been looting. People had crept out onto the battlefield to strip the dead of their possessions, and certainly in some cases to kill the wounded who protested at being looted. That took place. The work of rescue itself certainly didn't begin until daylight, and then had to go on for 2 and 3 days. Some of the wounded of Waterloo were not brought to first aid until the 3rd day after the battle. And of course, a vast number of the wounded had died of shock and of thirst. So many of the thousands of dead of Waterloo died after the battle, not during the battle.
4 days after the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated as Emperor of France. The military genius, who for 2 decades had stunned and terrified Europe, spent his last years in exile on the island of St. Helena. Napoleon had perfected the gunpowder army, just as the next revolution, the Industrial Revolution, would change war and civilization forever.